So you may be aware that there's tons of 3D software out there, not just Blender. And we don't have to use Blender to accomplish what we need to in Web3D. The reasons I chose Blender and the reasons I promote it to other people, especially getting started. The biggest one is that it's free. There's no risk in trying it out. You're not exposing yourself to anything. You're not subscribing to anything. You don't even have to give it an account. You just download it and start using it. So it's the most accessible. Because it's free, it has the largest community. Right? There's no bar for entry for this. You're going to find everybody playing with it, from 13-year-olds to longtime software professionals to industry professionals in various industries. With this huge community, sometimes the community is crazy and sometimes it's helpful, but it is a gigantic community and you can find niches within that community that work best for you. It also has probably the most resources. Another good reason to jump into Blender is it does so many different things. It has video editing, modeling, animation, using it for 3D printing. It does a lot of different things, and you don't have to subscribe to other products or figure out how to integrate them. You just use it. Also, for developers, it's important to know that you can extend it with Python. And it is one of the more extendable 3D software packages out there, to the extent that they publish an API, and there's a community of developers who extend it or sometimes compile their own custom version to do what they need to accomplish. And then the last item, which is a pro and a con, is it is evolving very fast. So it's getting lots of attention. It's becoming more of a normal thing to have in different professional industries. Part of that is because of the capabilities that it's getting, but as it is evolving fast, things do get broken sometimes. There's always new ways to do things that you used to know how to do. If you're not in it constantly, then it can go past you. But once you get used to the basics, you should always be able to do those basics. You're just going to be left behind in terms of some of the new features that people are playing with. The fast evolution can get overwhelming, but it is generally it's a good thing because it allows you to have access to new capabilities without having to, you don't have to follow those new capabilities. They're there when you need them. There's several ways that we can import objects. The oldest and most cumbersome way is to go to File and Append. And from here you can choose a blend file, and you're going to have to know the name of the assets that you want to import. And you can drill down to find them, whether they're in meshes or a scene or whatever. There's a couple of easier ways to go. One is an add-on that I like called KitOps. There's a free and a pro version of KitOps. What it allows you to do is to just add an asset into the scene wherever the cursor is at. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a character real quick. I'm going to hit Add Insert because I have nothing selected, and you can see it's added in the middle of this block over here. I'm going to move him out, and you can see that is done. So something else that's cool is if I have something selected and I hit Add Insert, I can hover over it, and it's going to put the selected insert on the surface wherever I'm hovering over. And I can scale them up and down, rotate it, etc. The last way I'm going to show is we've got the Asset Browser. Asset Browser is relatively new to Blender. I'm going to replace my timeline here with the Asset Browser. Change from current file to user library, and I've got a few things in here. This will work similarly where you can drag and drop it. You can also just drag and drop it into the scene. You can set things in your file into assets, and you can also just grab other people's assets that they've shared with you and use them in your scene. I mentioned all these different ways because you're going to want to set up as much as you can inside Blender to get it kind of close to what you want, and then export it, and it'll be a little easier to work with later. Because this video is focused at developers, we're going to have to go over some Blender basics. If you are already familiar with Blender, or you've watched a bunch of other videos, which I definitely encourage you to go look at Blender things elsewhere, then you can skip past this. I've included all the titles at the top So if you want to, search the video and find when the title changes, then I'd recommend going ahead and do that. Otherwise, stick around. We're going to do some very basic things for Blender. Probably the most basic thing to understand in Blender is that we've got the different tabs at the top. That's going to be essential for us to understand like which ones we need. The main one we're going to need for this is layout. Don't worry about most of the things that you're not going to understand. We're either going to be in layout in order to move things around or shading to mess with materials. Then we have the different views. Depending on when you get your file, whatever they had in their UI could alter some different things that load up for you. But we have our view, and it goes everything from wireframe, solid, material, and then a render preview. You're going to mostly be using material view in order to understand how things generally look. The render preview will show you especially how lights are affecting your scene. And then you might have to get down to solid mode or wireframe mode for performance, or maybe understanding how the geometry, the density of the geometry. If you open up your file and you find everything looks pink like this is just Blender telling you that it can't find the texture images to apply to the materials. In order to fix that, we're going to go to File, External Data, and find missing files. Then point it to the folder that's going to have all the textures. In my case, it's textures. Find missing files, and it should match everything up and immediately apply it to the materials. And there we go. So we're going to use Blender at least to what I call setting the scene. We want to try to bring everything in for the conversion process and get it as close to what we want as we can. We want to get rid of things that aren't going to be used but are get included into the file. We don't want extremely long download times for no reason. So I'm going to show you some basics for that before we talk about setting the scene. So once you select something, you can move it by clicking on G, and it's going to let you just freeform move it around. I usually like to lock it to an axis, so you can click X afterwards, Y. Obviously, I could do it for Z as well. I can rotate it with R. I'm going to set it to a 45. Oh. So this is another reason to lock things to an axis. So I'm going to rotate Z 45. And when I have something rotated, I can move something by the global axis, so G and Y. Or if I press Y twice, it's going to let me move it by its local y-axis. So it remembered what the object's y-axis is, not just the global y-axis. So fairly important thing to remember. I can also scale it, and I can lock the scale and different things to an axis as well by hitting the X, Y, or Z on those. You can add lights. Let's just do that really quick. To add anything, we're going to hit Shift A, and you choose whatever your mesh is, your light, etc. But keep in mind, not all of these things are going to convert over into Web3D, but we're going to talk about that in the next section called setting the scene. What you need to know is these basics of moving things around, scaling them, kind of getting them set up in a way that you need. One of the important things that I didn't mention is if you click on something and you hit X, delete, it's going to remove it. And we don't really want to talk about the different ways to hide it or just not render it and stuff, because we don't want it to show up in the file, and we don't want it to have to download to a client's browser when it's not going to be used in your scene. So just make a copy and remove anything that you don't want to show up. Then we have our objects that are within the scene that you can select just by left clicking, and we have our outliner, and by default in the top right, that shows you the hierarchy and relationships of different objects, whether they're cameras, meshes, lights, etc. And then whenever you have an object selected, or whatever is your active object, the last one that you selected, it's going to show its properties in the bottom right. And there's a lot of different properties here, but there's not a lot that you're probably going to have to use just for the purposes of the Web3D process. So in this section, we're setting the scene. When we set the scene, we want to get everything as close to what we want in the Web3D. We're going to have the objects here that we need. We're going to have the lights that we need. And we're going to position the camera relative to the objects and lights that we want to use later. When it comes to the objects, we have to know what objects are going to come over and what we need. So the objects that are going to come over are meshes and curves that have a fill. If a curve doesn't have a fill, it has nothing to show. These curves will come over, and this text will come over, even though it's kept as a text object that you can edit. In place, it's still going to come over in the conversion process, and we'll see that later. The other thing to know about the objects is what materials they're using. So not all materials are going to come over because some things are more proprietary to Blender and need to be converted. And like I said before, we're going to do that in a later dedicated video on materials. What you need to know for now is that simple image materials that plug into the BSDF shader, any images that plug in are going to work just fine. Any numbers and any colors, including emissions, are going to convert over just fine, but a lot of the other things will not. So you might have to experiment a little bit. We can use point lights or we can use the spotlights that are going to convert over. And for this, I do recommend being in a render preview because it's hard to see the impact that lights have when you are in the material preview. So you can interactively move these lights around, see how it impacts your objects, and that is something you're going to want to do because when you bring it over, you want to get the lighting as similar to you had it in Blender as possible. It's going to be easier to mess with it in Blender than in code, although we will have that option to do later. Besides the lights, we also still have the camera. I only have one camera added. We're not going to mess with anything else at the moment. And I'm in the camera view. You can go to and from the camera view either by using 0 on the numpad, or we've got this button here that lets you toggle in and out of the camera view. One of the cool ways to work with the camera is I can go to View in the sidebar and Camera to View, and it's going to move the camera according to whatever I move this view around in. So if I uncheck this, the camera stays still no matter where I go, and you can see that the camera is just there. When I move out of that camera's view, it stays where it was. But it's usually easier to check this, use the camera to view, and line up your shot with the frame here in order to set what you want. You want to try to organize everything in your scene in Blender as much as you can. What we're going to look at now is what everything is named and how it is parented or in a collection to other things. When you have everything in Blender, we have the outliner over here and it allows you to organize things into collections, which is pretty handy. And then we have the names of the objects underneath. What you need to understand is that the collections aren't going to survive the conversion process. So when I have SVG logo as the collection name and then a collection underneath it called SVG, these objects of S, V, and G are the only things that I'm going to be able to reference after I convert it over and then I'm using it in a website. So be careful in what you name your objects. Don't expect the collections to help you understand what they are. So in order to rename something, we're going to go to one of these, and you can click on it and hit F2, and then you can rename it. Hit enter, and it'll rename it, and that name is going to carry over into your JSX file that we're going to work with for the website. Speaking of materials, if you need to change the name of a material, click on an object, go here to the materials, and this box right here, you can change the material name. If you're working with a material, like in the shader view, I'm going to show that in a minute. So we'll click on an object. We're going to go to the shading tab at the top, and it's going to bring up the nodes for that shader. If this is the view that you're editing a material in, then you come over here and you can rename it there, and that's going to show up in your file. Now, while we're here, I want to mention that some things are going to come over great into the Web3D process based on what you did in Blender, and other things not so much. Any basic colors and images that you connect to a principled BSDF shader are going to work just fine. But the more complex that you get that Blender doesn't know how to convert, the less likely they're going to come over. So this one has some more clever things done with the material. And in order for that to ever make it into the Web3D stuff, it needs to be simplified. But we're going to go over that in the larger section that's just going to focus on materials. Just so we can talk real quick about what did make the conversion process. You can see all the materials for this character came over fine, for the plants and the curves, because these are just basic colors. Most of what makes up this material did not survive. It has some reflection properties, but nothing else. This came over because I turned it into just a texture. Now let's take this and export it. So you're going to do File, Export, go to where it says GLTF2. And we want to save it into the public folder of what we pulled down in the repo. I'm going to go over that real briefly again if you missed the last video that went over this. But we're going to save it to the public folder and call it model.glb. We want to remember export settings, go into include, check these three boxes for custom properties, cameras, and punctual lights. Come down to data and then check compression. Go ahead and export it. Now that it's exported, we're going to go into VS Code. And the model.glb should be here. You can't look at it because it is a binary, but this is the public folder that I was saying to save it to. If you pull down the repo, you cloned it, then you will have the public folder, and you can put the model.glb into this public folder. Once it is there, what you want to do is in a terminal window. So if you're not familiar, you go to terminal, new terminal, but this is the developer video, so I'm assuming everybody is aware of that. And you're going to type in, you're going to go to the source directory, and from there you're going to go npx gltf jsx, and then point it to that model.glb. Once you run that, it's going to create a model.js. You already have a model.jsx, so delete it. Let's rename the model.js to model.jsx. A couple things to notice here. These lights are a little crazy. I did make an update since the last video where I put in some settings that handled these lights without having to remove them. So let's not worry about that at the moment. We're going to get into a separate section for lights. Let's find the camera and just set this to true. And this is going to use the camera view that we set, and that's going to be the default place that it starts, so that people can move from that, but they aren't locked into it unless we remove the orbit controls, but it will start from there. So your work with the camera to frame your shot in Blender will pay off. So once you've done all that, you're going to save it. And then in another terminal window, you're going to run npm run dev. It's going to come up with a link. And then in your browser, you're going to go to that link and you will have the scene. And this will let you move around. You see it has the lighting, anything that came in. Material-wise, works great. Zoom in, zoom out. And then you now have a process that works end-to-end. So as you make changes in Blender, you can quickly convert it over to the JS or the model.jsx. And this is already going to pick up everything that you changed, the development server. So you don't have to mess with this beyond that. And we'll do something later on how to publish it if you don't know how, but working with it in this dev mode is pretty nice. Thanks for joining me on this video. We will have more. You need to do the usual YouTube thing, subscribe to see them, and come join us on the Discord in order to discuss what you've got going on, share what your project is, and we can all help each other out. See you in the next video.